I want you to go with me to Ezekiel, the verse I asked you to read. And I wonder what you felt about Ezekiel 14. A very interesting... sorry?
14:20.
14:20, sorry.
That's right, 14:20.
I want you... Glad you got me on my toes. I want you to... It's an interesting verse. Tony, will you read it for us? Verse 20.
Surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, they could save neither son nor daughter. They would save only themselves by their righteousness.
Incredible verse, that, isn't it? You know, a lot of people say to me, well, my wife goes to church and therefore I'm all right. And I'd like to say this, that even if your wife does go to church, her righteousness will not be able to save you. Do you understand? It's a decision that you have to make. It's not something that you can pass on. I know that in certain faiths, there are people who actually pay penance for their dead ones. Yeah. They actually pray or even allow themselves to be baptized for the dead. Sure. And baptism, you know, when Jesus spoke to Nicodemus, he said to him that there's two things that you need to understand very clearly. You need to be born of water, which means you have to make a decision, and you need to be born of the Spirit. You need to be born of water. Not somebody else born of water for you. You need to be born of water and of the Spirit. And people don't understand it, but baptism is just an indication to people around you that you have made a decision to follow God and to be His child. That's what the decision is. The baptism doesn't say you're going to be a successful follower. The baptism doesn't say you're not going to not fall. No. Baptism is just saying where you declare, it's like your marriage. When you say I do in front of the minister, it doesn't mean that maybe you're not going to be unsuccessful. The probability is you're going to fall. The probability is that if you are successful in that decision that you made, you know, it's quite scary when I think of that they say 2 out of every 3 marriages are ending up in divorce nowadays. Now let's just recycle that and say, put it this way. Imagine 2 out of every 3 Christians who give their lives to Christ are going to fall away. That's a little scary, because it means that somehow we haven't learned to endure. Now, I make this clear. When you look at these particular people, even Noah, now you know the story of Noah. Even Daniel, man, that's a story that Daniel in the lion's den. Job, all that he went through. None of them. And I love the story that we get there, because it's saying to you that they went through bad things, but they could save themselves only. They couldn't save somebody else. The interesting thing about Noah, though, and the interesting thing about Daniel, and the interesting thing about Job, though, is that when you make your decision for Christ, your influence can save your family, as in the story of Noah. Your influence can save a king, as in the story of Daniel. Your influence can save your family, as in the case of Job. So I think that we have good examples there, that when we make the decision, it has a very good influence on those around us. So that's one of the reasons why we should persevere. Now I want to come to, we've already been plowing on it and pondering on it, so let's go to Revelation chapter 8, because I want to jump straight in there today. And I want you to understand something that, you know, I've been studying Revelation 8 and 9 in the context of Revelation, the book of Revelation, for the last about 24, 25 years.
Longer.
Yeah, maybe longer.
Because when I started with you 8 years ago, 7.5 years, it was 20 years then.
So, it's a long time. And the point that I'm trying to make, you know, that as I've been trying to write a book on it, and I have about close on 300 pages of writing. And then I have to go back and start changing some of it already, because I'm just discovering that sometimes when you put something down, and this is something I want us to start off with. Although, and I mentioned this, although we talk about, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I can only say with clear clarity, and I want you to understand this, that number 7 is the only one that I don't think is being effective. Now you're going to smile at me, but the fact is I'm very convinced that number 6 is busy now at the moment.
You're talking about the trumpets?
Yes. Now it doesn't mean that number 1's not blowing. You see, one thing I want you to understand is that if in the context of the third, in the context of 7, in the context that 1 is part of 7, I want you to understand something. Whenever you look at 1, look at 7. Whenever you look at 3, look at 7. Don't look at number 1. And the reason why I say that is there's a tendency, I'm not sure if you understand, but in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, we have 7 churches. And what theologians tend to do, which is a interesting thing, but we've got to be very careful what happens when we talk about the trumpets. For example, Revelation chapter 2 talks about the first church of Ephesus. Now, Ephesus was, all these churches were real churches in the time of John's writings. They were in existence. So we already have something saying to us that, and this we're talking about AD 70 on. We have this experience of Ephesus. And then you have Smyrna and you have Pergamon and etc. You have all of them. They were all there. But yet in the context of Revelation, it is known that Ephesus was the early Christian church. It was a period of time that the early Christian church went through. And then the next church, the next period of time was Smyrna, then Pergamon, etc. The church that we are interested in is the church of Revelation chapter 6, which is the final church, number 7, Laodicea. Now, according to the chronological steps, we are number 7 when it comes to the churches. But if you look at the character traits of some of them as to what they are, you can also be some of them. But now I'm going to say something that's going to sound quite strange. A person who was in Ephesus cannot be in Laodicea. Now, that is where it's going to be a bit challenging now, because I'm saying to you that if you did belong to the early Christian church, you could not experience what's going on in Laodicea because you're not there.
Sure.
You're not in that time period. But you are in Revelation 7, in the 7th church. You are Laodicea. And what does Laodicea know that church number 1 didn't know, and church number 2 didn't know, and church number 3 didn't know? The history. Church number 1 had nothing to look at. They were church number 1. But church number 2 could look back at church number 1. But they couldn't look at number 3. Church number 3 could look back at 2 and 1, but they couldn't look at 4, 5, and 6 because they weren't there. But we, if I understand the word of God correctly, we are number 7 in the church structure, and therefore we can look back and from a historical point of view say, wow, that's interesting, that's the traits. I can see that is what happened there. And if I can say that they fulfill their different roles, then I can say that what I know about number 7 is a reality. And number 7 means you're lukewarm, you're not hot or cold, you haven't made a decision. And it's saying about the church of God in the end that we haven't even invited Christ into our lives, because he says in the Revelation chapter 3, look at this. He ends his message off by saying, and I want you to look at verse 20. Here I am. God is speaking. I am. Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. Now I want to ask you, Craig, on which side of the door will you have to be in order to knock? To have entrance? Inside or outside? That's a scary verse when it comes to us as Christians living in the end. We're living Christianity without Christ in it. We actually going through all the roles of worship and praise and all of that. But the person that we're supposed to be worshiping and praising is not even part of our whole thing. He's actually asking for invitation to come in. So it's actually saying to me that there's a lot of Christian people out there that are actually under the impression that they are right, but they haven't got Christ. You're not all right. And so the first thing we need to consider if we look at this, do we have Christ? That's the first thing we need to figure out. Have we opened the door? Have we invited him in? And it's something we really need to do a heart search about. Now let me explain something to you. 1844, I always talk, it was the end of time. And really what should have happened at the end of time, Christ should have come. But now something that is quite strange, and I'm going to ask you this. Let's make it 1854. Is it possible that Christ could have come in 1854, Tony?
Oh, yes.
Why?
Well, not impossible.
Because you see, everything that was to have happened from a time frame point of view is finished. So it means that at any time now, he can come. But why isn't he coming then? Because we haven't opened the door. So it's not that God doesn't want to come, it's that he's waiting for us to be ready so that we can come. Now, this is the interesting thing about Revelation, chapter 8 and the trumpets. The trumpets, I believe, and I'm going to touch it again using the word I'm going to show you just now, but we've spoken about it before. The trumpets basically, if I just stand next to you, Tony, and I'm busy watching a soccer match, and I pull out my vuvuzela, whatever you call it, and I next to you here. Now that's really blowing your ears out there. Are you going to know I've got a trumpet?
Well, now you've got a vuvuzela.
And are you going to take it and whack me with it after a while?
Yeah.
You know, the interesting thing is that the trumpet is there to cause a noise. But now in most people's ears it's a noise, but to me I'm motivating my team. To most of us, when we read about the trumpets, it's a noise. It's hailstones mingled with blood and fire hurled down on the earth, a third of the tree. And it's like what? Now the interesting thing is that we have in God's word the gifts of the Spirit. You remember that? And one of the interesting gifts of the Spirit is speaking in tongues. Now, I don't want to question anybody's ability in speaking in tongues, but I want to ask you that if you do that, please give me an interpretation. Because somehow God is telling you something that you need to tell me, and I need to know what you're telling me. Now, if you don't tell me, then I've got a problem with it, because why has God given that to you? It's like if I got a tune and I'm blowing it and you don't tell me what the tune is, what are you helping me with? What's the point? If we have the 7 trumpets blowing and we don't know what the point is, then we've got a problem. And it's our purpose to find out what the tune is. Now, the interesting thing, and I'm saying this to you, and as I said, and as Garth has now made it even more, that I've been studying this for longer. And the interesting thing that I find, I want to tell you, I Google it. I go and look to find out how many people are writing about the 7 trumpets. Man, and some of the stuff that they're writing is, I don't know where they get the information from. But I don't know anybody talking about this. And yet, if you think of the day of Yom Kippur, which was the most important solemn day of the Jewish feasts, because the day of Yom Kippur was the day of judgment. That is what it meant. It was the end. Now, prior to Yom Kippur, you had the Feast of Trumpets, which was for 9 days. And the interesting thing when you look at that, and I want you to listen to what I'm saying to you, is that each trumpet period was as solemn as Yom Kippur almost. The difference is that in the trumpets, you carried on with normal activity. You would still go and buy and sell. You would still be, but You would almost live in the atmosphere of Yom Kippur. Now in Yom Kippur, you don't work, you don't do anything, because Yom Kippur is when God comes. All activity on planet Earth ceases. Now we are told, according to the word, that as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the end. People will be marrying, giving in marriage, buying property, selling property, carrying on. They will be doing the normal things. But they were not prepared for Yom Kippur. Now Yom Kippur is going to come, and they're going to be carrying on going to work. And the interesting thing is, you can carry on working, but it doesn't mean anything anymore, because the end has come. So somehow, and I want to tell you, since 1844, I see that we are living in a period called probation, which can end at any time. Any time along this journey, it can end, because 1,000 years to God is like one day, and one day is like 1,000 years. From here on, we are living in the last days, not the end of time. Time is finished. We are living on borrowed days. So let me carry on with this in mind. You want to say something, Craig?
Sure.
Yes.
I was going to say, I don't know how many of us are going to actually get there.
I love that. I like what you've just asked. Jesus tells a story about a rich man. Well, let's go with me to that. Luke, quickly. Go with me to Luke. And I want you to look at Luke chapter 18.
It's possible for man, it's possible with God.
You're too quick. Luke chapter 18, we see this rich man come along. Now, most of us wish we were rich, because rich people solve all the problems that they have. They don't have any problems. If a problem crop up, here's money, solve the problem. That's how we look at it. But I want to tell you, when it comes to sin, you can't use your money. Now, the interesting thing, this man comes along.
But also, sorry, they also believed that the rich were blessed by God.
Yes.
If you were poor, it's a scourge from God.
Yes.
You are suffering because you're not blessed and you've done something wrong. Or
So, for example, Garth will be blessed and I'll be scourged. So let's look at this. The interesting thing here is that this rich man comes to Jesus, and verse 18, and he starts off by asking a very interesting question. And the way that he approaches Christ is by referring to him as what? What's it say, verse 18, Tony?
Good teacher.
Good teacher, or good master. Now, he's already saying something about Jesus. He didn't say, wealthy master. Or, yeah, you got a lot of bucks, man. You know, we can be friends. He looks at him and identifies that the character quality of the person is good master, good teacher. What can I do to be like you almost? Then Jesus says, keep the commandments. Don't steal, don't bear false testimony, etc. And it's interesting, if you read those verses, he's referring to the last 6 commandments of the 10 commandments.
But he also says, why callest thou me good?
We're coming to that.
Sorry.
We're coming to that. But he refers to the first, but he's referring to the 6 commandments, not the first 4. I'm amazed at that. He asks him, he says to him, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false testimony, honor your father and mother. Those commandments are the last 6. What about the first 4? Now, the interesting thing is that the rich young man says, wow, you've actually referred to the right ones. All those 6 I've been doing. Then Jesus says, that's wonderful. But have you done the first 4? Now, if you had to define, when Jesus was once asked, what is the greatest commandment? They were defined in 2 commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your mind. And it means that you must love him before you love your money. You must love him before you love your family. You must love him before anything. Now, the first 4 commandments is your first priority is to love God. I'm telling you, that's your first priority. Your next priority is to love your fellow man, because that's the last 6. But this man was loving his fellow man, the last 6, but he wasn't loving God. And you can't truly love your fellow man if you haven't loved God yet, because God is good. Why do you call me good? No one is good except God. And he's saying to the young man, you need to love God first, because if you love him, then you can be good. But he thought he was good because he was keeping the last 6 commandments. He loved his neighbor, so he thought. But when Jesus said, take all you have, sell it, and then he challenges him. He says, give it to the poor. Now let's see how good you are at keeping the last 6. And he's thinking, whoa! But then Jesus is saying, but didn't you just say you keep them all? Then you would love your neighbor by giving him all your money. It wouldn't be a problem. But he loved money more than his neighbor. He wasn't willing to do that. And then that already reveals to me that he didn't do the last 6. But did he do the first 4? Then Jesus says, and follow me. So now he's saying, give all your money to the poor, which shows that you love them, and follow me, which shows you love me. And he turned it down. And then the disciples look at Jesus, because he makes this comment. Look at verse...
Peter, I think, asks, then who can...
No, hang on, before that, verse 24.
Yeah, okay.
What's verse 24 say?
And when Jesus saw that he was very sorrowful, he said, how hardly shall they that have riches enter into the kingdom of God?
Now, immediately when we look at it, we always think of riches in the sense of mullah, of bread, but it's not. You know, there's a lot of good people. They're really good. You know, sometimes I look at people and I think, wow, that person's really good. But it's saying that be careful that you think that by being good you can get to heaven. It's hard for a good person to get to heaven. It's hard for a rich person to get to heaven. And so the disciples reacted. Simon Peter reacts to it. Who then can be saved? That's the question Craig just asked. Who can be saved then? And then Jesus says something. What does he say there?
It's impossible with men, it is possible with God.
Wow. Now I want to come to this. Now I want to come back to our Revelation chapter 8. You know, people are always telling me what the devil's doing. The devil's causing havoc, he's killing, he's stealing, he's doing all those things. But I want to ask you, what is God doing it? What is God doing? The devil seems to be very active, but is God active? And I want to tell you, the 7 trumpets tell me he's active. Because you see, the Revelation chapter 8 introduces us, if you look at verse 5, the last part, there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Whenever you read that in the sentence, it means God's busy. God's on the mountain. God, you know, it's like Elvis has left. God is in the room. When you see lightning or thunders or earthquakes, I want you to know, the moment that verse is introduced, God has just been introduced as a God of action. Now the problem is, we all know what the devil's doing, but we don't know what God's doing. And the 7 trumpets basically tell me what God's doing. Now, we read in Revelation chapter 7 that what God was busy with, what he had announced from here on, is that he was going to seal his children. Now, sealing his children means that he puts you through the furnace, and then when you've gone through the furnace and he sees everything's right, he seals you. He's doing it. You can only react to the fire. You can either be pickled or preserved by the fire. Your reaction to what God is doing determines basically the result. That's why Peter and James say, count it joy when you experience fire. Because fire is basically purging you. John chapter 15, Jesus introduces himself as the vine. He says, and you are the branches. And what is God waiting for in you? He wants fruit. But who's the husbandman? And the interesting thing that we read there in John chapter 15 is that the Father in heaven is the husbandman. So who's the one that's actually active in your life trying to save you? The Father is. God so loved the world that He gave His Son. That means the Father so loved the world that He's saving the world. And somehow we think that after the cross of Calvary He stopped saving. No, He's sitting back on His own throne saying, I've done it, I'm finished now. No ways. He is still busy with you, and it's called the time of wrestle. At this present moment, and I want to tell you, most of the world, inhabitants of the world, don't know it, but they're wrestling with God. It's like Jacob on the other side of Bethel. This bloke grabs him. He has no idea that in the end he gets this idea that, hang on, man, this is not a normal fight. I'm fighting against God. And in the end, he realizes he can do nothing when it comes to muscle power against God. And all he can do is cling on to Him. I mean, he holds on for dear life. And I can imagine an angel trying to kick him off, and say, hey, I've got to go now. And he, in the end, says, I will not let you go until you save me. Bless me means to add to your life. Now, I want to tell you something. This wrestling match is a wrestling match that Jacob didn't just have on the other side of Bethel. He had the wrestling match the first time with God when he decided to deceive his brother by giving him a pot of food for his birthright. He already was in the wrestling match, but he lost that one with God. Then he was in the wrestling match when he deceived his father. He lost that one. If it had to be at the plan of salvation by that one, he lost it. Because he was saving himself. And you cannot enter God's kingdom or save yourself by your own good works. I mean, one of the most disturbing stories to me is Jacob. Because, we have this wonderful impression that he's a wonderful person. But I'm going to ask you this. If a burglar breaks into your house, Craig, would you send your wife to go and wrestle with him and then you run into the bedroom? No. That's exactly what Jacob did. He sent his servants ahead first to meet his brother Esau because his brother was coming to kill. So he's going to kill them. That's all right, I get away. He sends his wife and children next. I mean, Jacob is a coward. He's on the other side of the Jabbok River. And, although we get this impression, when he's tackled there and he realized it's for his life, he wasn't going, his brother Esau was still far away from him, but he was fighting for his life now and he thought it was somebody else. And in the end, this person became stronger than who he was. Everything that he had done was not successful, but finally he comes to his senses and he realizes that he's been doing it going about it the wrong way forever. And he finally surrenders to God. And then God shows. Now listen to this. The wrestling match has just been taking place. Now God is still proactive here. And he turns to Jacob and he says, your name will no longer be Jacob, which means deceiver. But I'm changing it to Israel. Because you have wrestled with me, the most important wrestling match. And you have prevailed. Now, I believe that you and I have to prevail. Now, coming back to Revelation chapter 8, talks about the individual hailstones. And I want to tell you something. It talks about it landing on trees. It talks about it landing on grass. Remember that. Now, last time we realized that trees and grass is just a matter of position. Trees hold greater position, greater influence, greater power compared to grass. But does it say the hailstones missed the trees? Now I want to tell you something. I believe that it's hard for a tree to survive the hailstone unless the trees press together. I don't know if you've ever seen these storms, but when you get a hurricane coming through a clump of trees, you'll find that the clump of trees tend to survive, but the tree that was standing separate from the clump of trees gets blown over. And we are counseling, one of the reasons why we as businessmen should get together if we are the trees, it's so that we can survive the storm. Now, a lot of people below us are dependent on our survival. Because if we should fall, the birds that were in your trees fall too. The animals underneath the trees have to find other place. And there's no possibility of any trees growing there again. When a big man falls, the word says, with what a fall he crashes. Man, and you can look around you in the business world. When a big business suffers, it has a ripple effect, which seems to be so careless. But I want to ask you, what's happened to the green grass of those big businesses? They get burnt up. The incredible thing about green grass, though, as I told you before, it can still grow. But a tree that has fallen down, 90% of the time it never grows again. You cannot afford to fall if you are the tree. So how do we survive it? Now, why I'm bringing this out is just to let you realize that from this time there's been leaders, there's been trees, and there's been grass. You know, in actual fact, there's a word used in some of the terminologies of people who study with Freemasonry and all of that stuff. And I sometimes just listen, but they say that the rest of mankind is goyim. You know, they're just the cattle that are led out to the slaughter. It's not about them, it's about the survival of the trees. But that's not what God's word teaches. And what I'm trying to say to you here is, from this time, from 1844 on, trees have come and trees have gone. Grass has come and grass has gone. Now, why I'm saying this to you, because the moment we talk about a third, remember we mentioned the third? When you talk about third, was it a third here, or is it a third later, or third when? Now I want to tell you it is a third right from the beginning. The interesting thing about the 7 trumpets is that I can only conclude that number 7 hasn't taken place, but all the other 6 are. In actual fact, I'm very concerned, but I think we're really a lot here, although these are all happening. Okay, because we have problems in the world, don't we? In actual fact, the problems are more severe than what they were before. If you had earthquakes here, you really have earthquakes here. If you have famines here, you really have serious famine. If you had droughts here, you really have droughts here. It seems like, I just heard last night that somewhere, is it in, I don't know if it's Denmark or wherever, Brussels, they just had a terrible bomb explode again and a lot of people killed. What's going on? Okay, those are, I want to tell you something, serious signs of the times. Okay, now let's jump to number 8.
Sorry, Billy,
yes.
In what you call today, it's like say 6. Does it refer to the trumpets blowing, or does it refer to the trumpet blowing? Because if it says
if I just say to you that the trumpets are blowing, plural.
That is referring to all of them, like you're saying.
Yes, so let me explain it. But let me put it this way to you, because I want to show you how this progresses. You must remember, from 1, 2 is almost worse than 1. And 3 is worse than 1 and 2. And 4 is worse than 1, 2, and 3. So if you haven't responded in 1, the probability that you'll respond in 4 is rare, because if you think of Pharaoh, he had 1 plague, could have responded, didn't respond. Finally, by plague 9, he still doesn't respond. Then finally his son is killed. All he was doing was sealing the fact that he had made up his mind already on number 1. Now I'm going to say this to you, Craig, just to bring home something, because I'm going to explain the others now. But number 1 is the problems that you experience in your life. Now I'm saying if you're not responding to the problems that you experience in your life by coming to God, then you don't have to worry about number 2, because you haven't dealt with number 1 yet. And if you are experiencing number 2, which I'm going to show you are, and you haven't responded to number 1, I'm a little worried, because number 1 wasn't successful in changing your mind. Number 2 probably will, but it probably won't, because now it's already a 50-50 chance. But by the time I get to number 3, it's a chance in 30%. By the time I get to 4, it's a chance of 25% chance. By the time I get to 5, it's a 20% chance. By the time I get to 6, man, you've already made your decision. And if you haven't made it by then, and the word counsels me, some of them still don't, and I'm thinking to myself, what else must God do to get you to change your mind? Now, look. It's like when your child smacks. You smack your child once, yes.
Look what he did to Jacob to change his mind.
To change his mind.
Look what he did to that. What's his
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar. Ate grass for 7 years.
7 years. You know that. I wish I could go into that more, but you know that in the course of the 7 years, in year number 1, he could have changed his mind, but he refused. He was stubborn. I mean, what does God say to Paul? How long will you kick against the pricks? I mean, what's going on with you? I mean, you're kicking me. Haven't you noticed that? Now, I want to tell you, we are in a wrestling match with God. And I'm hoping that as I disclose this, your eyes will be open. You'll actually see God trying to get you to a place where He's concerned because He doesn't want to come back until you're ready. Now, let me just,
we talk a lot about suffering and, like disasters, and we see it here on earth. When you asked the question earlier, where's God? What does He do? And I think what needs to be mentioned as well is that when Paul, you spoke about that encounter, he says, how long are you going to be kicking up against the goats? How did God introduce Himself to Paul on the Damascus Road? He said,
what?
Paul.
Saul, really?
Saul, yeah. Why
do you persecute me?
But where is Jesus at that moment in time? He's in heaven. And people think Christ is no longer suffering. But the way He introduced Himself to Paul on the Damascus Road was the suffering Christ. He didn't say the church that you are persecuting or that you're about to persecute. He says you are persecuting me. So Christ is suffering at the present state with those who...
Well, that's wonderful what David is saying, what you've done.
It's not a detached God who is not suffering when we are suffering. He is suffering in the moment with us.
Well,
and saving us in the process.
Well, let's look at Matthew quickly, just to bring home that point. Thank you, David. I think that was a good point. But look at Matthew chapter 25, and you look at verse 31. It talks about the sheep and the goats, and He separates them. And then they say, "But how did you? When did we help you?" And all of that. And then I want you to listen to these words. Jesus says in verse 35, "I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was a stranger. I needed clothes. I was sick. I was in prison." Then the righteous will ask Him, "But Lord, when were you hungry?" etc. He said, then verse 38, what does it say there?
When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, "I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me."
Now, isn't that amazing? I want you to understand sometimes that we're going to have our own battles, but our priority should be helping others, truthfully. And we don't realize it, but in helping them, we're actually helping ourselves. But I want to get to Revelation 8, because I want this particular verse. Now, verse 8 says, "The second angel sounded his trumpet." Now, I want you to know, if you have any questions regarding the first trumpet, please come and speak to me, but I don't want to elaborate on it more. It's trials that come to you. If you're a tree, be careful, and if you're grass, just know it's going to be quite severe. But I want you to notice now, it says in verse 8, "The second angel sounded his trumpet," and then it says something like a huge mountain. Now, whenever I read that, I kind of wonder, is it a meteorite? Something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood. So, if I had to draw my little sketch now again, and I had to draw planet Earth, this time I can only draw a huge mountain, all ablaze. And it's hurled down on planet Earth.
Almost like the sun.
Okay. Then it says, you see, there's nothing more. It's just a huge mountain all ablaze. Okay, now this is very important to pick up here, because I'm going to show you something about that huge mountain. But it hits planet Earth, and it says there, what's it say? A third of the sea, sorry, a huge mountain fell into the sea and it all turned blood. So we have the sea, I'm just going to put it, all turns blood. Now that tells me that it's a universal effect. Okay, nobody got away. Then it says, this interesting, a third of the sea turned to blood, into blood. Sorry, I apologize. It was thrown into the sea. Made a mistake. But anyway, I like what I've done there, but I'll explain on it now. But a third of the sea turns to blood. Again, we have this third concept. But now this time, I'm not going to draw my pie graph. I'm going to put third here. Okay. A third of the sea turns to blood. And then it says a third of the living creatures in the sea died. And what's it say about the ships?
A third of them were destroyed.
A third of them destroyed. Now, what's the next verse?
The third.
What? So we don't want to read the third because we are now busy with number 8. Number 2, trumpet. Explain to me, before we can understand this, I'm going to come to you, and this is going to be quite incredible. From here, we've already experienced this thing already on several occasions. But now, if you go with me, I'm going to ask you this. Which is the God that God personally identifies that's in opposition to him? Now, I'm not going to answer it today.